Hello and welcome to another episode of Battlefield Breakdown, and welcome to the second episode of the War Termination mini-series within the series of Battlefield Breakdown. So this time I will talk about how to operationalize a favorable outcome of the Russian full-scale invasion against Ukraine. As I mentioned last time, we need to get into a situation where Putin has to decide between peace and power when he will choose power, of course. But how to get there and what are the useful pressure points? That is, of course, open to debate. Now, before I start to go into my to-do list, what can be done, what needs to be done, I have to say that all of the stuff I will talk about now for the next couple of minutes, they are all useful measures. They're for itself not decisive measures. So none of the stuff I'm talking about is just because it's there, decisive and as a standalone thing will bring victory. And I will allude later on what that says about and how we should coordinate all these different measures. So, of course, as this is a military mini-series, I will start with what are urgent requirements to at least keep Ukraine in a fight. So we want to avoid for a minimum that Ukraine loses because of the bitter consequences we talked about last time. Well, that would at least mean to maintain Ukrainian armed forces in a fight. And that is easier said than done because we have, of course, delivered a lot of weapon systems to Ukraine. The first big batches were basically Soviet-era equipment that was left over from the transition to NATO equipment by most of our Central and Eastern European allies. That was good and nice, and that could be quickly implemented because in most cases, Ukrainians were already trained on these systems and knew them. The problem is that these stocks have by and large expired. You won't get all too much into Ukraine. Just look at the contract books, for example, of the Czech manufacturer Excalibur Arms, who are renovating T-72 tanks for Ukraine. Their books were full with batches of 90 main battle tanks in 2022, and now we are down to batches of a few dozen, maybe a dozen per year. That is the problem because we need to find hulls in the first place that are worthy of being renovated and shipped it on. We have then moved, of course, to Western type equipment, but basically most of this equipment is from storage, old M1113. They're good stuff. They work, they're reliable. But of course, it's a second-hand product. We have a lot of Leopard 1 and Leopard 2 tanks. We have M109 artillery systems that are still the mainstay of the deliveries to Ukraine. Everybody talks about the fancy new stuff, but these are the mainstay. They're all second-hand systems. They're all from storage from the Cold War. And the Cold War storages, unfortunately, will expire this year. So in order to keep Ukraine in the fight, equipment-wise, we need to come up with a strategy how to stay in Ukraine over 1 year of war, 2 years of war, 3 years, maybe even longer in the war. That requires first a Ukrainian co-participation that is discussed under all these security arrangement umbrellas, that Ukraine is involved in repair and maintenance job, in producing spare parts, producing ammunition, but also assembling entire weapon systems if that is possible. But we also need to talk much more about acquisition of new equipment for the support of Ukraine or to replace stuff we have given to Ukraine or will be in the need of giving to Ukraine over the next 2 to 3 years. Here, European politicians especially are not quite honest with themselves about how much they have and how much still needs to go. If we have achieved that, of course, we have to care for the quasi-obsolescence. What I mean with that is that Ukraine has a lot of weapon systems, especially Soviet legacy, but there's no ammunition and equipment or spare parts for them. Air defense is the most prominent part. Fighters is another chapter that will come up soon. Everybody talks about F-16 as a game changer, but in fact, F-16 is a Western warplane that, especially if you talk about older A, B models, will basically keep up the fight that the MiG-29s and Su-27s have been fighting in 2 years of aerial warfare now. They will be there to help against drone and cruise missiles attack. They will be there to keep the Russian Air Force out. Everything beyond that, of course, would require much more hulls, much more aircraft, and extensively modernizing them. But of course, it's much easier for NATO to source ammunition for F-16s as it is compared to a MiG-29. We produce and we still store a lot of air-to-air missiles that Ukraine can use. So this is taking care of the quasi-obsolescence of many Ukrainian platforms. And that needs to be planned in advance as well for, as I said, 2, 3, maybe 4 years from now. Then, of course, we need to talk about increasing the lethality of Ukrainian defenders. So we're still talking about the kind of scenario 2, we want to avoid victory. The problem is that a war of attrition, Russian losses are horrible, but Ukrainian losses are also there. And of course, demographically, Ukraine is starting from a slimmer base than Russia. So we need to take care that the defensive task Ukraine performs, it needs to perform this task with as few casualties as possible, because it can't afford having large amount of casualties. And that would mean to, for example, increase or better the ratio of fire support. 5,000 shells per day is the defensive minimum, but of course it still guarantees Russia to have a roughly 1-2 or 3-2 fires advantage across the board. If you defend with a much slimmer fires disadvantage, or if you even achieve parity or fire superiority, your defensive task gets much easier. The other thing is qualitative fire support. Ukraine now is a GPS denied environment. A lot of precision guided weapons, we used to think that they would take care of a lot of jobs, don't work. Can we provide cluster ammunition, which is even more lethal than much of the precision-guided ammunition? Can we provide different kind of precision-guided munitions that strike, for example, high-value targets like jammers that erodes this Russian advantage? Can we co-develop this with Ukraine, teaming up, for example, with very cheap means of production on the strike means like strike drones to make them more lethal, make them better in finding their targets, and hence attrit the Russian forces faster? Can we fetch in a long-range strike campaign into that? Because it's pretty inefficient to just wait for thousands of refurbished and renovated Russian vehicles to roll across the border and kill them there. You can also start to hit the assembly lines. You can start to hit the ammunition production lines. You can start to hit the energy that is produced for export to generate revenues for the Russian war machinery. All that you can do. We can assist Ukraine sourcing parts for long-range strike means. We can supply them with some. All these are, of course, means to increase the pressure on the Russian military machine, still on the purely on the defensive. However, here I need to state, we really need to talk, will a defensive posture of Ukraine alone apply sufficient pressure on the Russians politically to at some point seek an end to the war? We are talking now about, of course, expiring stocks. We are fascinated by this perspective that soon Russia might run out of MTLBs or BMP-1s. But the problem is, what if Russia scales down its offensive action in 2026, for example, but continues a strategic bombing campaign just to erode Ukraine's morale? Currently, we are assisted in the defensive work, if I may say so, by relentless Russian attacks that increase the Russian casualty numbers. They might not sue for peace, but still not go in such murderous assaults. What then? How to apply then pressure on Russia? Then, of course, the question would arise, what would Ukrainians need to come on the offense? And that is, of course, even a higher benchmark in terms of military support. We would need to talk about setting up dedicated assault engineer brigades or battalions to help breach the extensive Russian defensive lines. We need to talk about new technological means as well as new tactical procedures to breach them. We, of course, need to even out the force quality disparities that plague every army that rests on mobilization. We need to invest much more, for example, on combat information systems, Ukrainian electronic warfare systems, in addition to Ukrainian deep strike capabilities, in order to allow them to actually have the toolkit to conduct another offensive. We need to dramatically increase Ukraine's logistical capabilities, because supporting a force on the defense is a task, but supporting a mechanized force on the offense is an even bigger one. And of course, we need to work on Ukraine's capability to plan and conduct such an offensive and to lead large formations at once in a maneuver battle, something that proved to be a bit of a problem in 2023. So all these things, of course, take time. While Ukraine is now on the defensive and will stay on the defensive for some time, of course, but we need to use this time not to go by wasted, but to start to build up the capabilities on the Ukrainian side to conduct this. But then will offensive operations alone end the war? Probably not. Economic pressure is also an important part of the game. We saw the G7 summit, and actually there was some very encouraging news coming out of the G7 summit. We, for the first time, will see extraterritorial sanctions on companies that support the Russian war effort. That might, if it's properly implemented, two fingers here, if it's properly implemented, might significantly derail Russia's smuggling and sanctions circumvention infrastructure. We saw new restrictions on the banking sector. They come out of the US, but it is expected that the other G7 countries, they have agreed to them. They will, of course, now work within the European Union to implement them. There will be countries like Hungary and Austria that will squeal and scream. But ultimately, it's the credibility of the European powers in the G7 that's on stake now. So I hope that this will yield results better sooner than later. It will, of course, increase the difficulties of Russia to source foreign currency for its war effort. Then, of course, we can, be more strict in sanction implementation. We can sanction better the revenues that Russia needs to keep up its war machinery up. That is, for example, to lower the oil price cap, to better implement the oil price cap sanctions, to sanction liquefied natural gas exports of Russia, to sanction also uranium exports by Russia, as well as to sanction Russia's nuclear technology, which still creates quite some revenues for the Russian war machine. All of these elements can, of course, still increase the pressure on the Russian side. But how to make victory out of that? As I said, all these are useful steps. How to make them decisive? By carefully planning them over a long period, and of course by synchronizing them. The problem we have is, first of all, that our premises for military support and for sanctions are not conducive to a victory. On the military support, especially in the US and Germany, the first premise is no escalation. The second premise is we cannot weaken our own commitment and defense capabilities on any other front. We see this argument coming up not only in these two capitals I named, but also in many others when, for example, Boris Pistorius tries to convince people to donate Patriot batteries to Ukraine. Everybody says, no, I need them for myself. We saw that, for example, during the ATACMS discussion when America was not so much worried about Russian red lines, but they were deeply worried that pulling ATACMS out of current defense plans in the Asia Pacific or even in Europe, that would weaken their defensive capabilities. Well, the problem is winding Russia down won't come cheap. And we need to live up to the fact that we have to sacrifice something for that, militarily, security-wise, and financially. And especially on the European front, I mean, the European theater, NATO contingency, here I have to say, as long as the Russians are bogged down in Ukraine, of course we can sacrifice our own capabilities. The Danish did so, the Baltic countries did so. There's a clear understanding that now is the opportunity to do so. Later on, we won't have that, but it's in our own interest. Here, a rethinking of how much, at what pace, and what quantity we can deliver needs to take place. The second thing is our economic priorities have always been, we can introduce sanctions, we should harm Russia, we should stall the defense industry, but it shouldn't hurt us. We haven't introduced sanctions on sectors where price increases would, of course, have or do economic harm to Europe as such, especially now with presidential elections coming up. The oil and gas price is a big concern, but there are other European countries that have concerns about the aluminium price and steel price, etc. So it's easy to point finger at government A, or in this case at Washington, but we can all happily point fingers in circles on this. The problem is that this as well needs to be rethought. Fighting down Russia will have a price. We either pay later on in the blood of our own children, or we pay now in money. I prefer paying this in money, but this is up to everybody to make up his mind about it. And the second thing is synchronization. As I said, there are different elements in all of this. There are defensive elements, how to increase Ukrainian defenses that can be implemented now. There are there need to be offensive elements that need to be prepared now, and they need to be well synchronized. So that means that we see how the Russian war effort goes on when the Russians have phases of strength, of weaknesses, and then plan our offensive and defensive strategy in the war, just according to how they perform and what opportunities arise. To come back to the 2023 summer offensive Ukraine tried, there were a lot of voices in Europe as well as in the sea that aired the hope that a successful Ukrainian summer offensive would pave the way to negotiations and would end the war. Well, even if the Ukrainian summer offensive were fully successful and all the tasks set out at the beginning would have been achieved, it would not have ended the war. Why? Because at the time, Russia was still in a phase where they introduced newly mobilized forces. They started to grow their recruitment programs on contract soldiers. They ramped up, they were in the beginning, in the midst of ramping up the defense industrial production, the ammunition production. That has almost doubled since the early days of 2023. Their tank production have increased. They started to source stuff. They had the first contract with North Korea. So from their side, everything would get better in the later half of 2023 and then in 2024. So why, even if there would be a setback at the beginning of 2023 or in the midst of 2023, why should Putin forgo his theory of victory? He would then have to attack again from an adverse line. And that sucks, of course, but that doesn't spoil his war plans and theory of victory. He would basically have continued the war. Ukraine would have continued the war from a more advantaged line. They would have a shorter front. It would have made things easier for them to defend in the winter. It didn't play out, but it would not have ended the war. Now imagine the same offensive. Let's imagine it's successful. But it would happen in 2027 when Russian war production has long peaked. A lot of refurbished Soviet stock equipment was already used at the front. There is no imminent perspective of Chinese arms supplies. The war economy starts to struggle. There is high inflation. There is an overheated economy. There is domestic rumblings. There is discontent about how things are in Russia. The Russian army tells to Putin, well, we would need time to recover. And in this period of weakness, the same successful Ukrainian offensive falls. The psychological blow would be much larger than if the same offensive happened at a phase where Putin has a math that things will get better over some time. Then the same offensive might actually end the war because Putin might seek peace without Ukraine conquering every square inch of Ukrainian territory. In all that I said these are all useful elements and we all need to plan them in advance, but we'll also need to carefully synchronize our economic, our informational, and our military support to Ukraine according to the time frame of both Ukrainians' recreation of forces, mobilization, and strength and weaknesses, but also the Russian strength and weaknesses. This kind of synchronization into a long-term war plan, not just thinking about how do we secure Ukraine's survival until the imminent presidential elections, but the year thereafter and the year thereafter. That is called strategy. All the rest is tactics. The problems I had with previous Western discussions, whether they are about tanks, whether they are about infantry fighting vehicles, whether they're about Ukrainian strikes into Russian territories, we all talk tactics. And yes, there are a lot of things you can improve tactically for the Ukrainians. But how do you end the war? Where does it lead to? How does it interplay? How do we synchronize? What's the long-term plan for all of this? This is a question that is not yet answered. And last but not least, we are facing the NATO summit in Vilnius, especially for Ukraine. If in the West you think that a truce without full recovery of the occupied territories is what is achievable and the rest is not, then actually you really need to think and how do you prevent a continuation war, which is also what we talked before. If you really want to avoid a continuation war in Ukraine or a larger continuation war in Europe, then I don't see any possibility of doing this without getting Ukraine into NATO. Of course, it can be decided when. It needs to be decided under what circumstances, with what mechanisms, but without getting Ukraine into NATO, whatever we do is just a prelude to the continuation war.